We begin this morning, though, in Washington. Today marks the start of President Biden's second year in office. It comes right as his agenda takes another major hit, a defeat overnight on voting rights and getting rid of the filibuster.
This morning, an NBC News poll brings more bad news for the Biden White House. His approval rating is at its lowest level yet. But yesterday, in only his second domestic news conference, the president defended his accomplishments so far while sounding off on a variety of hot-button topics, from his COVID response to tensions with Russia. NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli joins us now. Mike, good to see you. So let's get to that NBC News poll out today. It shows the president's approval rating is at 43%. That is the lowest point of his tenure. Faced a lot of tough questions yesterday. So how is the president defending his first year in office?
Well, Joe, a lot was made of the fact that yesterday was only the second formal White House news conference of the Biden presidency so far. But he made up for lost time, I guess you can say, by having a press conference that was twice as long as the first one he held last March. And he did take a lot of tough questions about some of the stalled priorities, some of the promises he made that he hasn't yet fully delivered on. The message, to summarize it from this president, was we've done a lot, but there's a lot more to do. And he did sort of hint at this sort of change in strategy that we've been reporting on over the last few days. The frustration he has about having been spending too much time in Washington and not talking directly to the American people. You also got a little bit of a glimpse of how that midterm strategy might be unfolding as the president kept repeatedly pressing Republicans to answer a key question. Let's take a listen.
I did not anticipate that there'd be such a stalwart effort to make sure that the most important thing was that President Biden didn't get anything done. Think about this. What are Republicans for? What are they for? Name me one thing they're for. What's Mitch for? What's he for on immigration? What's he for? What are they for? What is their agenda? The American public is outraged about the tax structure we have in America. What are they proposing to do about it? Anything? Have you heard anything? I mean, anything. I haven't heard anything.
So, Joe, midterm elections are often a referendum on the incumbent party in power. The Democrats control Congress. They control the White House. You see there the president trying to make the midterm elections more of a choice for voters. Republicans' vision or Democrats. Obviously, the Democrats have spent so much of this year fighting with each other. Some of those policy divisions playing out too publicly in the view of many. But the point that the president is making is, you know what we stand for. We stand for a lot, not always on the same page, but Republicans, in his view, not standing for anything.
So, Mike, one thing that will almost certainly be an issue is the pandemic this year when it comes to the midterms. COVID was the #1 issue when he took office. At the time, he essentially said, we have to solve that first. That'll make it easier to tackle everything else. So a year later, do you get the impression he still feels that way? What is he saying about the White House response to the pandemic?
Yeah, if you think back to the 6-month mark of this presidency, the president was declaring independence from the virus. We hadn't yet seen the Delta wave. Infections were at an all-time low in this country, but that certainly picked up, and that's been a big part of the frustrations of this White House. But the president acknowledging it's also a big part of the frustrations of the American people. He insisted that there are going to be no new lockdowns. He encouraged Americans to continue to get vaccinated, but he also talked about the toll this pandemic continues to take on Americans. Let's listen.
After almost 2 years of physical, emotional, and psychological weight of this pandemic and the impact it's had on everyone, for many of us, it's been too much to bear. We're in a very different place now, though. We have the tools. We're also increasing testing. Should we have done more testing earlier? Yes.
So the president acknowledging there that big issue of testing. Also, the White House, of course, yesterday releasing a plan to get protective masks out to the American people. The bottom line from this White House has been we're a long way from where we were a year ago. Millions of Americans, hundreds of millions, in fact, have been vaccinated, and we have the tools we need to fight this moving forward.
And, Mike, as you predicted, he was asked about 2024, Vice President Kamala Harris's performance and her place on the 2024 ticket. Real quickly, what did he say?
Well, he made it pretty clear and pretty simple. She's on the ticket, and obviously, by extension, he's running for re-election. But you know what? We're going to keep asking this question. The vice president today, doing her part, doing what running mates do, doing a lot of interviews to talk about the president's news conference yesterday as well.
Including an appearance on the Today Show this morning. All right, Mike Memoli. Mike, thanks so much.
On Capitol Hill, two of the president's top priorities were dealt serious blows. Last night, two Democratic senators joined a united GOP conference in rejecting a rule to change the filibuster, all but dooming federal voting legislation. It comes as the president suggests paring down or breaking up his expansive Build Back Better spending package after failing to win enough support for it in the Senate. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale joins us now with more on these overnight developments. Hi, Ali. Good to see you. So let's start with that Senate defeat on voting rights and the filibuster. Tell us what we missed. What should we know?
Yeah, Savannah, tough day for Democrats because there's going to be a lot of disappointment, but not necessarily a lot of surprise with how this shook out. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer pressed ahead on these series of votes last night, knowing all too well that this was likely to come down the way that it did, with both Manchin and Sinema joining Republicans to stop the Senate from changing its rules and thusly dooming this effort to pass those voting rights bills that you just mentioned at the top of the show. And with that disappointment now comes the next push for this. Senator Kyrsten Sinema, for example, explained why she voted the way that she did. This echoes what she said on the floor just a few days ago. In a statement, she said, "Tonight I voted again to support legislation safeguarding and expanding America's access to the ballot box." Sinema referencing, of course, that she voted for the voting rights bills that fell short of the 60 votes that they needed to avoid the filibuster and thusly did not pass. And then Sinema goes on to say, "I also maintained my longstanding opposition to separate actions that would deepen our divisions and risk repeated radical reversals in federal policy, cementing uncertainty and further eroding confidence in our government." The second part of that statement, of course, echoing what Sinema has said in the past on maintaining the filibuster, in this case, not changing the Senate rules in a targeted way that would have allowed Democrats to change the rules just on voting rights and actually pass this package of legislation.
So, Ali, what does this mean is next for voting rights? Is there any hope of a federal bill, at all, but never mind before the midterms?
Yeah, there is going to be a turn now to some targeted changes that speak directly to some of the things that we saw that led to the January 6th insurrection, specifically targeting the Electoral Count Act, which should shore up some of the loopholes that Republicans tried to exploit in the role that the vice president can play regarding electoral certification of the election results. This is something that Senator Joe Manchin, for example, said that he was going to look ahead to. He said that this was a good thing that they should do, but Democrats have been clear. Even though Republicans want to work on something targeted like that, that's fine. But Democrats have said that's not enough, and they want to see a continued push on voting rights. It's entirely possible then that we could see them try to break up key pieces of things that were in the John Lewis Act as well as in the Freedom to Vote Act. That could come down the line. But first, in this immediate moment, a lot of disappointment. President Joe Biden effectively saying the same thing in a statement last night after these votes shook out. He said he's profoundly disappointed in the United States Senate that they have failed to stand up for our democracy. However, he says, "I'm disappointed but not deterred. We'll explore every measure and use every tool at our disposal to stand up for democracy," and the vice president will continue to lead that effort.
All right, Ali Vitale, thank you so much for catching us up on all that. Good to see you.
The Supreme Court made a key ruling yesterday that impacts the investigation into the January 6th attack on Capitol Hill. The court rejected former President Trump's effort to block the release of White House records to the January 6th committee. And within hours of the decision, hundreds of pages were turned over to the committee. Those documents are related to the events and communications within the White House around the time of the riot. Let's bring in NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos for more on this. Danny, good morning. So what was the reasoning behind the court's order here, and is this the end of this specific issue?
The court did something it loves to do, which is essentially punt in a way by allowing the lower court's decision, in this case, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, was allowed to stand, and essentially because the president's argument that he was the incumbent or not the incumbent anymore didn't factor into the D.C. Court of Appeals decision. For that reason, the Supreme Court arrived at the conclusion that, well, hey, if it didn't matter to the D.C. Court of Appeals, it doesn't matter to the Supreme Court. And so essentially, they let the D.C. Court of Appeals be the Supreme Court, and that decision stands. The effect of this, really, yeah, technically there's still a case ongoing, but what does it matter, because the documents are now being turned over, and you can't unring that bell.
Yeah, and so as you just said, the House committee says it already has started receiving the documents. So what now? Where does the investigation go from here?
depending on what these documents contained, I mean, at least 700 different pages of things that President Trump wanted to keep concealed, so to speak. The investigation goes from here to reviewing those documents. And you can imagine that if President Trump really, really wanted to prevent them being disclosed, they may contain at least something somewhat interesting. But I mean, that's mostly speculation because they've just been turned over and they've been kept essentially secret until now.
Danny, quickly, what's the response from the former president and his legal team? Any idea what their next move could be?
Their argument throughout has been essentially that presidents need to be able to safeguard their private, not their private communication, so to speak, but their deliberative thoughts. In other words, if you're at a meeting and you're coming up with ideas, people are going to be less likely to speak candidly if they know that their every thought is going to be disclosed someday due to a request by Congress. Now, one of the things that he has a point about, and Justice Kavanaugh penned a statement in response to the opinion, is that, look, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we're going to release President Trump's documents, if an ex-president has no say, then ex-presidents hereafter will never have a say in the documents that get released. And if that's the way society wants it, then we need to be prepared.
Danny Ceballos, thanks so much for your analysis. Appreciate it.
Now, frustrations over the latest wave of COVID cases were front and center in President Biden's news conference Wednesday. While acknowledging that testing should have been a priority sooner, the president insisted that the country was on the right track toward ending the pandemic.
Some people may call what's happening now the new normal. I call it a job not yet finished. It will get better. We're moving toward a time when COVID-19 won't disrupt our daily lives, where COVID-19 won't be a crisis, but something to protect against and a threat. Look, we're not there yet, but we will get there.
Joining us now is Dr. Anand Swaminathan. He's an assistant professor of emergency medicine at St. Joseph's Hospital in New Jersey. Dr. Swaminathan, thanks for being with us. So first, just your reaction to that. Do you share the president's optimism that we're heading toward the end of the pandemic?
I think we've made a lot of good moves recently, but I think we still have a long way to go. I agree with President Biden that we have a lot to do still. Getting tests out is a big step, but only 4 tests to every home is a problem. There's lots of multi-generational homes, lots of people living in apartments that are having trouble accessing. Savannah, I have a household of 5, so 4 tests, not quite adequate. So we still need to do more work there. Getting masks to people is great. The fact that people can just go and pick those up is perfect. We don't really want to have any barriers to that. But we have seen the Supreme Court knocking down OSHA's ability to protect workers. That's a huge problem. We need to have more vaccine mandates. We need to have a system to track who's vaccinated, a real system with passports or however we want to define that. But we need an electronic system that people can verify that they have, in fact, been vaccinated. And we need a bigger push for global vaccine equity if we're ever going to really control this pandemic.
That's a great point about the number of tests. I mean, not even enough just in general for your family, but also multiple exposures, multiple times that you have symptoms, all those types of things. Now, Doctor, I want to ask you about a confusing one. There's a lot of stuff here that's been confusing. There's a lot of talk about mixed messages from the CDC. I mean, if you've been on the internet, you cannot avoid the memes that is sort of poking fun at this mixed messaging. So help us with this one. They're out with new research that shows that a prior case of COVID, having had the virus already, may have protected people better than the vaccine during this Delta wave that we experienced. But that sort of contradicts public health messaging and experts saying, of course, that the shot is the best, as we've been hearing. What is the takeaway here, and what do you think about confusion caused by headlines like this? What does this ultimately mean people are supposed to know?
I think we need to dive deeper into this data, this information, to really know what to make of it. And this is the hard thing with science. We know it's going to change. We know it's complicated. And so we really need to dive into it and make sure that we completely understand what's there and how to communicate that with the public. And what we do know is that vaccines will not protect from every infection, but what they do an amazing job at is protecting against severe disease. And that is still the best protection against severe disease. And of course, getting vaccinated is better than getting infected because you don't run the risks of things like long COVID or, of course, the infection itself, which can have dire consequences. So the best plan right now is still to get vaccinated. If you were infected before, even better to get vaccinated because your immunity is going to be extremely robust. So the message is still the same. Get vaccinated. If you had it before, get vaccinated. If you haven't had it, get vaccinated. That's still the best thing to do to protect yourself.
All right, doctor, before we let you go, we also have a viewer question for you. We've been loving this. Our viewers have been submitting so many great questions. Today's question comes from Coachella, California, and it says, I've been fully vaccinated and I got the booster, the Pfizer vaccine. I tested positive for COVID and want to know how long I have to quarantine if I don't have severe symptoms. I think this is a great question that gets at what we were just talking about, the confusion over some of those CDC guidelines. What's your answer there, doctor?
This has been pretty confusing. So 5 days is the absolute minimum. If you tested positive, even if you have minimal or no symptoms, isolate yourself for 5 days from everybody that you can in order to protect them from getting it. And at the end of that 5 days, if your symptoms are improving, take a test. If the test is negative, you pretty much can go back to your usual stuff. If you want to wear a mask for a couple of days around other people, that is always a good move. If your test is positive, you should continue to isolate. And this is where the CDC guidelines fell a little short. We should be working in tests to that. Of course, the difficulty is in people who can't access tests. So what if you're at 5 days, your symptoms are getting better, but you can't access a test? The best thing to do would be to continue to isolate, or at the absolute minimum, make sure you're wearing a high-quality mask anytime you're around anybody else.
The importance of those tests and people having access to them yet again on display. Dr. Anand Swaminathan, always great to have you. Thank you so much. And now if you have a question for one of our doctors, let us know. As you just saw, we are reading them straight to them so they can answer your questions. Email us at morningnewsnow@nbcuni.com with your questions. Thank you also for those of you who have just sent nice comments. It makes us happy in the morning. Also, please let us know if you want to stay anonymous.
New policy is already having a major impact on college athletics. The NCAA announced effective immediately eligibility requirements for transgender athletes will now be determined by the governing body of each sport. The ruling overturns a more than decade-old policy that was uniform through all of college sports and based on hormone therapy requirements. The change comes after UPenn swimmer Leah Thomas, who is transgender, recorded the best times in the 200 and 500-yard women's freestyle. Under the new policy, Thomas would need to be in line with the policy of USA Swimming in order to participate in the NCAA championships in March. The change also comes as nearly a dozen states have enacted laws restricting transgender athletes from competing in school sports based on the gender they identify with. Let's get a check now on your Morning News Now weather.
Bill Cairns joins us now. Hi, Bill. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Kind of a tricky situation and tricky forecast in the Northeast this morning. We were concerned that we were going to get the timing of the cold air along with the precipitation and that we would get some freezing on the roadways and the surfaces. And it is happening, but the cold air has been a little slow to move in. So snow totals have been knocked down. And so far, the morning commute from D.C. to New York is just wet. It's also a wet, rainy morning from New Orleans through the Panhandle up through Alabama and in even areas of central Georgia. The blue on this map shows you where the snow is. The green is the rain. So it has been raining overnight from D.C. to Baltimore to Philly to New York, southern New England. Now it's beginning to change over to snow. Temperatures are falling, but they're still above freezing. So a lot of the roadways will just be wet, at least for the first half of the morning commute. And a lot of our computer models are now only saying maybe a ½ inch to an inch of snow, and most of this may just be on the grassy surfaces or on car tops. A lot of the roadways, since they're already wet, the snowflakes may melt as they'll hold on to a little bit of that warmth. So just be careful, especially bridges and overpasses. Those are always the first to ice over anyways. And as far as the forecast for the rest of today goes, that Arctic blast is moving down through the northern plains. Minneapolis 3, Chicago 17 today, so that's really cold stuff. And that cold air is making its way all the way to Texas. Not often that you see San Antonio only with a high temperature of 37 degrees. That's going to set the event for the possibility of a little bit of icing as we go throughout the next 2 days. And the other issue is the Carolinas. We're still concerned with a freezing rain event and mixed with sleet, especially from areas from Florence to Myrtle Beach, Fayetteville down to the coast, the New Bern area, Kinston, Wilmington. So that's the icy concern forecast, especially tomorrow. But in the Northeast, so far so good. We're okay heading out the door. The roads are not icy or snowy yet.
Yeah, yet. I know, because it's supposed to get a lot colder today. All right, Bill, thanks so much. See you next hour.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.